All right, some big news lately with the announcement of the Final Fantasy Tactics remake, the Ivalice Chronicles. If you've been following this channel, you know I'm a huge fan of tactical RPGs. Lori is kind of as well, but not as hardcore as I am, and Final Fantasy Tactics really means a lot to me. I played a lot of Shining Force, a lot of the Shining Force series when I was growing up, and then when I got Final Fantasy Tactics, it was like a whole new world was just deployed at my fingertips. It was absolutely fantastic, and it was a game that I kept playing from its release date. I played it all throughout the PS2, and then after that I kind of would go back to it every now and then, but it is a game that means a lot to me. So hearing that a remake is coming was super, super awesome. That is, until we heard that there was no War of the Lions content, and then I got a little grumpy. But then I called it. I said something on stream a couple days ago pointing out my theory on why they were not bringing any War of the Lions stuff into this remake.
So maybe he's like, I didn't work on the PSP version, so it's not canon to me.
And lo and behold, it seems that that is kind of confirmed. You see, if you're not familiar with War of the Lions, it was a remake of the original Final Fantasy Tactics with a bunch of new lore, some new items, and some new classes, and some new content, and all this new stuff thrown into it. But here's the kicker. The original team from Final Fantasy Tactics and Matsuno, who created the whole Ivalice lore and created all of the lore for Final Fantasy Tactics, all of the story, and worked with the event planners and everybody to create all of this amazing backdrop and story events and all these things, they weren't part of War of the Lions. In fact, I think there was only one person from Final Fantasy Tactics that was part of War of the Lions, and that was the art director, and I'm pretty sure he was just brought along just to make sure that the art style remained faithful to the original, and that's pretty much it. He didn't do any lore, he didn't do anything like that. So you can kind of understand why the people who made the original game maybe don't really vibe with this stuff that some random mercenaries that were brought in to make a remake or a remaster, whatever you want to call War of the Lions, and threw in all this extra dialogue. You have to remember, Matsuno had all of this extra stuff planned for Delita. There was supposed to be a whole other scenario going in with his backstory and all of this stuff that they had to cut from the original game. And with War of the Lions, that team wrote Delita's backstory and wrote extra exposition and wrote all this extra stuff. Here's the thing, maybe it didn't really vibe with what Matsuno had originally planned and wrote for this whole game. And I think that's actually what's starting to happen, is that we're starting to kind of see some cracks show up, that maybe the FFT team didn't really like what War of the Lions did, and they're setting out to kind of go back to the original and make it the best it can be, and maybe set that up for a sequel, or set that up for some DLC for Matsuno to write some new lore or new things to build off of the original experience. Because that seems to be a huge thing that they're bringing up in all of the interviews. And one thing that really stands out is they said that they had to go back and decompile, reverse engineer the original Final Fantasy Tactics. If you're not familiar with how that works, essentially you go through, you look at all the assembly code that got generated from the compiler, and then you go back and you try and manually code C code that when it gets compiled again matches the assembly code that was compiled. It's an absolutely tedious task. There's people that are dedicated to reverse engineering and decompiling old games. You can watch people do it. There's this great one that does Castlevania decomps, and he goes through the whole process. It's really awesome to watch. That's essentially what they had to do with Final Fantasy Tactics. Here's the kicker. They have War of the Lions source code. How do I know that? Because they still updated the damn game. They still gave it updates up to like a few years ago. So they have the ability to work on War of the Lions. They chose to go back and decomp Final Fantasy Tactics, the PlayStation version, rather than work on this other version, which I'm getting a sense that they consider fraudulent. They consider it fake. They consider it Fugazi. They consider it like untouchable. Imagine that. Imagine if like you had the source code to something just sitting there and you were like that disgusted by it that you were just like, nope. But that's what they're doing here. And like I said, I believe it all stems from Matsuno and all of the original. I believe it's the head event planner that's back on this one, the art director is back on this one, and Matsuno's back on this one, writing the lore and exposition and extra dialogue and all that stuff. And he's back maybe in like an advisor role as well. And they don't want War of the Lions stuff. What's interesting to me has been the reaction from the fan base. And this is where I don't know really where I fall, because on one hand, yay, more classes, more this, more that, more content. But we also have to acknowledge that extra classes and the extra content didn't match or wasn't done by the original developer. It wasn't done by the original writer. It wasn't done by the guy who created this whole Ivalice world that spawned multiple games and had all of this lore and all of this things fleshed out. It wasn't done by him or anybody close to him or anybody part of his team. It was done by random mercenaries who were brought in, hired hands to just do it and come up with their own lore and their own characters and their own ideas. So I get why Matsuno and team and everybody else there doesn't want to really touch War of the Lions. But it is losing content. And it just makes me think of, if anybody's familiar with this, is Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops. Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops was a Metal Gear Solid game that Kojima produced, but he did not write, he did not direct, he did not advise, he did not do any artwork or anything like that for the game. He was solely there as a manager to make sure the product shipped. That was it. I believe they brought in a manga artist who wasn't even connected to Metal Gear to write the story. I believe that many of the leads on the team were not part of the Metal Gear team and did not work on other Metal Gear games. And there's been a huge controversy, not a huge controversy, you know. It was a controversy if this game was considered canon. And lo and behold, in all the future Metal Gear games that came after Portable Ops, Kojima never used any of the lore from Portable Ops. Essentially letting us know that he didn't consider it canon. He didn't consider it worthy of being part of his lore. He didn't consider it worthy of being part of his game universe. And he didn't use it. And that's fine. Nobody lost their mind at Kojima. Nobody said, hey, well, you need to use Portable Ops. You need to build off of it. You need to make sequels. You need to do this. You need to do that. No, they accepted Metal Gear universe is what Kojima says it is. And the Ivalice universe is what Matsuno says it is. And if Matsuno does not like what they did with War of the Lions, then you know what? Who are we to say? Like, this is the guy that wrote the entire Bible of that whole setting, the whole universe of that. He developed, he wrote, he penned it all. And if he doesn't want to use War of the Lions because he didn't like it or his team didn't like it, then who are we to argue? And maybe in the long run, we will get more exposition. We will get more maybe DLC or a sequel that will fill out more of Delita's backstory or more of these other characters' backstories and more of the lore and give us more background on things. I think that's what this is setting up. I think that this is setting up a clean slate where Matsuno could go and delete all of the extraneous stuff that other people not part of his crew added into the game, and now he can start and build from there. Because if you think about it, as a writer or a game developer, you know, he has his own construct of what Ramza and Delita and all these characters are. He doesn't know where the War of the Lions writers were coming from. How is he supposed to build off of them? So it just makes sense that he goes back to his world and his lore and his setting, which he created. So I think in the long run, this makes actual total sense. And I think of fans of the game One of the main reasons we are fans of Final Fantasy Tactics is the beautiful storytelling and the absolute amazing lore of the characters and the setting and just everything. It's amazingly well written. And if we understand that the whole reason that we got such a beautiful game is because we let Matsuno go ham and go crazy and write this beautiful, intricate story, then we have to let him cook now. It's okay to pull out these other ingredients that he didn't write, that he didn't approve of, that he didn't sign off on, that he wasn't part of the team for. Because as a fan, this makes sense. It took me like a day. It took me like a day to step back and think about it. But it makes sense, right? It makes sense. It makes sense why we're not getting the War of the Lions stuff. So if you're really angry that we're not getting the War of the Lions stuff, just take a step back and think about it from that perspective. Think about it from a creator's perspective. Think about it of a director, a movie director. Wait, why aren't we getting the War of the Lions stuff that he never signed off on, that he never approved of, that he didn't work on, that none of the original people who developed any of the events or story or plot or lore or characters ever signed off on or ever agreed on? Or you can't have it both ways, right? Right? So just think about it from that perspective. All right, guys. If you like this weird rant, be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and I'll catch you on the flip side. All right, later.